I love the guy. Berube made it clear he's a huge fan of Marner. Marner says he needs a couple of weeks to figure things out. And we know the Leafs were willing to move on from him because they asked him to waive his no move. So we understand that. Marty, then, with all that as a background, what's the right thing from your perspective for the Leafs to do about Mitch Marner?
Well, it's about asset management, right? Because you got to have the conversation. And I know, and I'm part of the crew that thinks that you cannot roll back the same core four again next year and hope that maybe it changes. You've done that for now 9 years, and it hasn't led to any success in the playoffs. But if you let Mitch Marner get to July 1 and be a non-restricted free agent, you're going to lose an asset without getting anything in return. So you have to explore all scenarios. Are the Toronto Maple Leafs a better team with Mitch Marner on the team? Absolutely. But does it work with the way that this team is built? No, it doesn't work. So maybe you got to look into, well, what if we have Marner, but we're trading another piece of our core four? What if it's Nylander that's on the market? What if it was Austin Matthews that was on the market? Maybe you have to explore all situations, because losing Marner and not getting anything in return is what will happen if he walks into unrestricted free agency. When you have some way, shape, or form of getting something in return, some assets in return, if you were to move on from somebody else in the roster. So do I think they have to bring the core four back? No. But is there a conversation to be had to say, oh, maybe we are bringing Marner, but we're moving on from something else because we need those assets? I think that is where the Leaf brass right now has to sit down and think, and also have the conversation with Mitch. If he wants to come back, Mitch Marner wants to be a UFA, there's nothing you can do about it. But if he was open to coming back, then you have to consider, okay, what would that look like? How much money do we have to spend on Marner? And what can we do with maybe moving another big piece to be able to recuperate some assets that way?
All right, the Austin Matthews mystery continues to linger. He wouldn't say what specifically was wrong, only that he got hurt during training camp. The good news is he says he expects to be back to 100% for the start of next season. So, listening to what he just said and looking back at the way the Leafs handled him, what do you think of the way the Leafs handled Matthews and his injury situation during this past regular season?
Well, because of what he said, he was clearly bothered by something. And because of his performances, I'm saying, well, he needed more time off. Like, he needed potentially the last 2 months of the season. Look, the Leafs were in a really good position in the Atlantic Division in the Eastern Conference to know that they were going to make the playoffs. Look, did home ice advantage matter? No, they had game 7 at home, and it didn't matter. So would you have rather rested Matthews and know that he was going to be maybe not even 100%, but closer to 100%, and be able to perform and be able to score? He had 3 goals in the playoffs. Like, it's got to be much better than that. So you had to be able to rest him. And I know Four Nations face-offs came into play and everything, but even that, it's about the Toronto Maple Leafs. And other teams, some players that were dealing with injuries said, no, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go. It's about my team. I think Austin Matthews and the Leafs needed to make the same commitment to say, we are going to give him some rest. He had some rest early in the season, but early in the season is a long way from the playoffs. I think the month of March and early April, there was a possibility for him to get some rest, to get closer to 100%, maybe not all the way full, but closer to it, to be better in the playoffs. And the Leafs and Austin Matthews did not take that opportunity. I think it hurt the Leafs, it hurt Matthews, and obviously you get the results that you did and getting out in the second round.
What about John Tavares? He says he's really optimistic about talks with the Leafs and that he can be back. If that's the case, what's a deal that could make sense for both Tavares and the Toronto Maple Leafs moving forward?
Well, originally, I was thinking, John Tavares on, a 1 or a 2 year deal, somewhere around $5 million was going to be the numbers. Okay, it was going to be, because John Tavares almost had 40 goals this year. He can still perform. So you got to pay him so that, he can feel like he is being paid the right amount. But it's not $7, $8, $9 million. So maybe it's, hey, listen, you want to be here, we want you, let's settle it at 5. But the more and more I think about it, and I look at, they have to re-sign Matthew Knies, and he's a restricted free agent, and could be the target of an offer sheet. You need the cap space. What are you going to do with Mitch Marner? I think you go on to John Tavares and you say, look, we want you on this team. You're a leader. You are a former captain of this team. You can continue to do your role, to perform, but it's not going to be the number that maybe you thought it was going to be. But John Tavares, in my opinion, doesn't want to go anywhere else. Like, he's not going to play in Minnesota or Chicago or Anaheim. He wants to be in Toronto. So it's about respect. You're not going to go out and say, here's $1 million and this is what you got to do. But at the same time, I don't think it's 5. I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think probably $3 million would be fine. You're not putting yourself in the top place with your salary cap, and you're not, disrespecting John Tavares either. So I think there's got to be a lower number than what I originally thought at around $5 million.
All right, there's been so much talk about the pressure in the Toronto market, but Berube, a guy who's played over 1,000 games and coached the team to the Stanley Cup, shot that down saying, you know what, there's pressure everywhere. Where do you stand, Marty? Is the pressure especially intense in Toronto, or is it just a matter of finding guys that can handle it?
The pressure is intense in Toronto because they've got 2 series wins in the last 20 years. That is why the pressure is intense. Look, I mean, the Edmonton Oilers won 2 series this year in the playoffs. They've already matched the Toronto Maple Leafs last 20 years in one playoff series, in one playoff year. And if you add last year, whatever. So any time in this 20 years, or let's look at the last 9 years with this group of players, like, you needed to have a run. And that's why the pressure is where it is. It is not because the fans are tougher in Toronto. It's not because the media is tougher in Toronto. It's because you look at year after year after year, and there has been playoff failures after failures after failures. 2 series wins in the last 20 years. That is why the pressure is so high in Toronto to go out and have a big spring and to be able to win multiple rounds, get to the Stanley Cup finals, maybe win a cup. That is the only reason. Look, I played in Philadelphia. There's a ton of pressure in Philadelphia if you don't perform. But the Flyers have also had some, they've gone to the Cup, right? They've won playoff rounds. So the same thing in New York with the Rangers. There's a lot of pressure in New York. The fans can get on you. We saw that this year. They had a terrible year. The fans, the media got on them. But they've performed well in the playoffs of late, and that is why it's a different scenario. The Leafs did not perform in the playoffs. That's on the organization. That's on the players. That is not on the fans. That is not on the media. That is because you've not been able to get it done in the playoffs in the last 20 years.
All right, our insider Pierre LeBrun asked a great question. He asked Berube, what's missing on this Leafs team that you had when you won the Cup with the Blues in 2019? He said a big part of it was being able to handle the pressure and not lose structure when things get tough in a game like Game 7. Marty, what does this team need in order to be able to handle the pressure of the big pressure games?
Well, you know what? It's funny because they did that in Game 6, right? They won a really close game. They kept the structure, but in Game 5 and 7, and completely fell apart. And for me, it's when your skilled players are going to be able to just buy into being, if you don't score, chip a puck out, block a shot. And look, Mitch Marner, who is one of the better penalty killers and can play the defensive side of the game, has blocked shots before, I think it's fine. Austin Matthews, we know now he was banged up. Maybe it was difficult. But I look at William Nylander. To me, William Nylander is the type of player that if he doesn't perform offensively, what else are you getting, right? And I think you need more players on the Leafs to be able to say, hey, if I'm not scoring goals, I'm going to help somewhere else, especially at the top end of the ledger. And right now, you look at Nylander, a big part of the success this year was William Nylander and his scoring ability and his production. But in the playoffs, if he wasn't producing, he was not there. Like, you did not see him. He had zero impact. And that's maybe where Craig Berube is looking at. Like, I need all my players to have an impact. If they're not producing offensively, you need to have an impact somewhere else. Maybe you win a game 1-0. You're not scoring that goal, but you're going to take away chances on the other side. And I think that's the biggest difference. When I look at Craig Berube's St. Louis Blues of winning the Cup, everybody bought in. And if you didn't produce offensively, you still had a responsibility defensively. I look at a couple of players that weren't really involved defensively and did not produce, and it cost the Leafs.
Berube says he was baffled by what happened to the Leafs in games 5 and 7 on home ice when it mattered the most. Now it's up to Brad Treliving to figure out if Berube has the right bodies to get past that, or if it's time to move on from some of those who have fallen short over the last 9 years.